In the year 2025, the world has 12 to 13,000 nuclear warheads, of which over 90% are in the hands of the US and Russia. What if I told you that this terrifying number is largely the result of a politically motivated myth and fake news in the US between 1949 and 1957? It may sound like an outrageous opinion, but is in fact pretty much what happens when the US Air Force, CIA, Congress, and administration decide to launch a massive nuclear arsenal increase based on completely erroneous information about Soviet nuclear capabilities. At the heart of these events stand four men: US President Dwight Eisenhower, his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, General Curtis LeMay, responsible for the excessive firebombing of Japan in World War II and now head of the US Air Force, and the Secretary of State's brother, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. Together, they will wittingly or unwittingly create the myth of the bomber gap, claiming that in the mid-1950s, the US is far behind the commies in strategic bomber deployment, when reality looks very, very different. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we covered the events of the decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I'm Spartacus Olsson. Okay, before we get to the meat of this story, let's recap the main nuclear events as the 1950s roll around. It's been 5 years since the US and British Commonwealth has shocked the world with 2 nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Against promises to Great Britain and Canada, who were integral partners to develop the bomb, the US has chosen to continue nuclear arms development without the Commonwealth. So until 1949, the Americans are the only nuclear power on the planet. The Soviet Union, at first behind in atomic bomb research, have caught up by a mixture of espionage and accelerated R&D. In 1949, they become the world's second nuclear power, outpacing US predictions of acquiring the bomb by several years. By then, the British have launched their own domestic atomic bomb project, and the United Kingdom becomes the third nuclear power in 1952. At this point, there are 2 ways to deploy an atomic warhead: tactical nukes by artillery or short and medium-range bombers, and strategic nukes by long-range or strategic bombers. In the early 1950s, the US is well ahead in the development of strategic bomber capabilities, and while the idea of missile deployment is maturing fast, it will only be in 1954 that the US deploys the first medium-range ballistic nuclear armed missile, the PGM-19 Jupiter. An intercontinental ballistic missile only exists as concepts in the rocket scientists' labs. In 1950, as the Korean War breaks out, there is a tectonic shift in US defense policy. The war with communist powers in East Asia and the Red Scare resulting from a series of Soviet spy scandals, especially the Alger-Hiss case, motivates a more aggressive stance against the USSR. The Truman administration passes the United States Objectives and Programs for National Security, better known as NSC 68, which shifts the focus of the relationship to communism from containment to confrontation, an attempted rollback of communist expansion. It also paves the way for tripling of defense spending from 5% of GDP in 1950 to 14.2% in 1953. One of the products of this increase is the hydrogen bomb in 1951, tested in 1952, a nuclear device many times more powerful than its predecessors. In line with the stepwise arms race that is already underway, the USSR follows suit the following year with their first hydrogen bomb. However, under the NSC 68, the idea of nuclear weapons increase remains purely as a passive deterrent, although head of the US Air Force, Curtis LeMay, is already advocating a release of constraints and repeatedly advocates deployment of the bomb in the Korean War. Truman, who personally took the decision to drop the bombs in 1945, not only opposes this, but installs the first control mechanisms that puts the final decision to launch a nuclear weapon in the hands of the commander-in-chief, the US president. Then, in 1953, Eisenhower assumes the presidency and shifts the gears on defense doctrine yet another step. His New Look policy, that comes into fiscal effect for the Department of Defense in 1955, takes a more economic approach than Truman's increased defense spending. Yet, It advocates an even more aggressive stance against the USSR and an increased public information campaign to promote the idea of a Soviet threat. To square that circle, Eisenhower drives for saving on conventional force and increases nuclear capability. He also softens the holdback on using nukes, while still maintaining that strategic nuclear arms shall be primarily, hopefully only, used as deterrence. He believes that tactical nuclear weapons should be part of the active defense arsenal, saying that, on strictly military targets and for strictly military purposes, I see no reason why they shouldn't be used just exactly as you would use a bullet or anything else. With the new look also comes the idea that deterrence can only be effective if it comes through a threat of massive nuclear retaliation. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles declares on January 12, 1954, local defenses must be reinforced by the further deterrent of massive retaliatory power. The way to deter aggression is for the free community to be willing and able to respond vigorously at places and with means of its own choosing. Dulles has now publicly admitted that the US is ready to nuke the Soviet Union if the need arises. His words in totality may be understood as that such an attack could possibly even happen as a response to non-nuclear aggression. The message is clearly understood in Moscow, and the race towards mutual assured destruction is on. For the US, the main hurdle to facilitate that is at this point no longer the creation of warheads as such. It's deployment ability that sets the constraints. Lacking any long-distance missile technology, this is only practically possible with a very capable and large strategic air force. This realignment of priority is reflected in a shift towards an air atomic capability in the form of an increased power to the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command, SAC, within a scaled-down overall military establishment. In person, this means Curtis LeMay. His forces shall now be enabled to minimize the threat, and since the major purpose of air defense is not to shoot down enemy bombers, it is to allow SAC to get into the air and not be destroyed on the ground to allow massive retaliation. In pure aeronautical terms, it means that the US needs more heavy long-range bombers, many more. Specifically, the swept-wing strategic jet bomber B-47 that enters service in 1953 and the B-52 that enters service in early 1955. Development and production of these planes is now scaled up dramatically, which may add to the feeling that the US is now set on a path towards power through intimidation and threat. But there are signs that this is not the ultimate goal, or at least not what the US administration would prefer. On July 18, 1955, at the Geneva conference between the Big Four, France, Great Britain, the US, and the USSR, Eisenhower proposes to Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin that the two powers should implement an open skies policy, allowing them to conduct surveillance overflights of each other's territory to reassure each other that none of them is preparing an attack. Back in Moscow, the de facto leader of the USSR, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, is suspicious of the US' true motivations, though, and the proposal is rejected. Now, Khrushchev is also probably motivated by a desire to not reveal Soviet nuclear deployment capabilities, in other words, strategic bomber capacity. However, only a few weeks after Geneva, on August 12th, that capability seems to be on full display to the world during Russian Air Force Day. On this day, the US' worst fears seem to be confirmed when wave after wave of strategic bombers fly in the bombastic air parade. But okay, before we get to that, let's backtrack slightly. The year before, in 1954, the US estimated that by 1957, the Soviets are going to be able to field about 50 of their new strategic bombers, the M4 Bison. That would grow to a maximum of 250 by 1958. Then, during the rehearsals for the Moscow May Day Parade in 1955, American observers count 12 flying Bisons, and the estimates based on US Air Force projections is increased to a possible 600 by 1958. Now, this is based on LeMay's team's assumption that the Soviets are producing 15 or more Bisons per month. CIA intelligence, based on captured Soviet information, and espionage, on the other hand, indicates less than 5 produced per month. And then comes August and the Russian Air Force Day, when during the parades, squadron after squadron of M4 Bison fly by, it looks very much like LeMay's estimates are correct. In Washington, the alarm is now sounding high. Could it be that the Soviets are about to outpace the US in nuclear capability barely 5 years after they tested their first atomic bomb? Now this is where head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, enters the story. You see, the lower CIA estimates do not fit the message of urgency being sent by his brother, the Secretary of State, and LeMay. So Dulles suppresses his own agency's information in March 56 by objecting to his Office of Research and Reports estimates being shared in the new NIE, National Intelligence Estimate. However, despite Dulles' objection, the Army, Navy, and State Department support the more moderate view by taking a footnote in the March 1956 NIE, stating that the number of heavy bombers could be far fewer than the Air Force estimates. Dulles admits that this might be correct in Senate hearings in April, but by now, no one knows what to believe. To eke out the truth, Congress puts together the Symington subcommittee in April 56, charged with finding out the most believable facts, a job they are doing inside a reality of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. In this environment of deterrence, it is obviously in the interest of the Soviets that the higher numbers are believed, and Khrushchev loses no time in cementing the belief in Soviet supremacy by publicly stating in May 1956 that "I am certain that we shall quite soon have a ballistic missile with a hydrogen bomb that can fall anywhere in the world." Note that he is speaking of missiles, though, not bombers, and we'll see why in a little bit. Bombers are, however, very much what is on LeMay's mind, when at the same time he publicly warns the US electorate that the commies are about to surpass the US in strategic bomber capability. The concept of a bomber gap between the two powers to the US disadvantage is now a public reality. In the following months, hard intelligence reports continue to contradict LeMay's statements, and yet on February 1st, 1957, the Symington Subcommittee reports that the United States has an insufficient number of long-range modern jet bombers and that the Soviet now has more jet-heavy bombers than the United States and is producing these bombers at a faster rate. In reality, U.S. strategic forces have more than 1,200 bombers capable of delivering about 2,000 nuclear weapons to targets in Soviet territory, while the Soviets only possess a few dozen bombers capable of delivering a nuclear device on the Americas. Even as late as 1962, the Soviets will only have about 160 bombers capable of delivering about 270 nuclear weapons to U.S. territory. Moreover, the number of U.S. warheads is far beyond what the Soviets have on hand. Moscow has 660, while Washington controls more than 8 times as many at around 5,500. That the inflated Soviet numbers are believed in the U.S. is not just by chance or due to some conspiracy orchestrated by LeMay and the Dulles brothers. It's the result of a deliberate strategy by the Kremlin to project strength that they do not have. At the Russian Air Force show, they have sent the same Bison air squadrons in multiple flybys, rotating in waves to inflate their perceived numbers. They have deliberately disseminated production numbers of aircraft and warheads far beyond their real capacity. Why? Well, they simply don't have the industrial capacity to keep up with the US. In fact, they have abandoned the idea of massive retaliation through strategic bomber deployment altogether. Instead, they are now forging ahead full speed to create an arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles. To arm those and keep up with the US armaments program, they're also ramping up their capability to turn out warheads. It's a terrifying development, but the US aggressive stance comes with a silver lining. Years later, Khrushchev will admit that while it did motivate the Soviets to ramp up the mad production of nuclear arms, it also tempered their plans for aggressive armed expansion, especially in Europe. Simply put, the mighty US nuclear arsenal made clear to the Kremlin that an outright war between the Soviet alliance and NATO would be suicidal madness. The concept of MAD had worked. But projecting our view into the coming decades, it also involves the atomic nations in a game of chicken, with the world powers tied in a dance on a razor's edge between standoff and global destruction. Time and time again, human error, miscalculation, and bravado diplomatics will push the world to the very edge of nuclear Armageddon. That we prevail is never guaranteed, and 7 decades after the Bomber Gap myth accelerated the deadliest arm race in history, humanity still stands balanced on that razor's edge, threatened by a nuclear storm that is only held back by the madness of mutual assured destruction. When I return to this story, we shall see how Khrushchev's threat of missile capacity develops and how yet another myth of Soviet supremacy comes to life. It is only because of the TimeGhost army that we are here at TimeGhost and capable of shining light into some of the most defining moments of history. To become part of that mission, head over to timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Excelsior!